The question of whether European Union sanctions can force Israel to stop what many describe as genocide in Gaza is layered with politics, economics, law, and morality. This debate has gained traction as images of destruction and civilian suffering dominate global headlines and as international institutions increasingly warn of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The EU, with its economic weight and its tradition of framing itself as a guardian of human rights, faces a critical test of credibility. To understand the stakes, it is necessary to examine how EU-Israel relations are structured, what sanctions as a tool of statecraft can realistically achieve, the internal divisions within the EU, the vulnerabilities and resilience of Israel, and the broader geopolitical context that shapes whether such measures would have any practical effect. The EU is Israel's largest trading partner, responsible for around 1/3 of its imports and exports. This relationship is governed by the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which gives Israeli products preferential access to European markets. Israeli exports to the EU include high-tech goods, pharmaceuticals, agricultural products, and chemicals, while Europe supplies Israel with machinery, transport equipment, and luxury goods. This interdependence gives the EU a real lever of influence. If it restricted market access, froze participation in research frameworks, or applied financial sanctions, Israel would feel the consequences in sectors central to its economy and international reputation. This distinguishes the EU from the United States, which is Israel's primary military backer, supplying billions annually in military aid, but with less economic leverage in areas like high-tech exports and research, however. The EU is not a single state, but a bloc of 27 countries, and decisions on sanctions require consensus. This is both a strength and a weakness. It ensures that actions taken are collective and carry significant weight, but it also makes ambitious measures difficult to pass. On Israel, divisions are sharp. Countries like Ireland, Spain, and Belgium have been outspoken in their criticism of Israeli actions in Gaza, calling for accountability and in some cases, explicitly accusing Israel of genocide. Meanwhile, states such as Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Germany often defend Israel, citing historical responsibility, shared security concerns, or alignment with U.S. policy. These divisions have historically made the EU cautious, preferring statements of concern and humanitarian aid rather than hard punitive measures. The performance of sanctions depends not just on the economic design, but also on the political will to implement and enforce them. Without unity, the EU's ability to exert meaningful pressure as undermined sanctions themselves have a mixed track record. They are not a magic solution, but a tool that can either succeed, fail, or backfire depending on the context. In South Africa, during the apartheid era, international sanctions, including those from Europe, combined with domestic resistance to help dismantle the system. In contrast, sanctions on Cuba lasted decades, but did not dislodge the government, instead deepening its isolation and strengthening nationalist resolve. More recently, sanctions on Russia over its invasion of Ukraine have significantly weakened Moscow's economy and isolated it from Western technology, but they have not forced it to withdraw or abandon its objectives. In Iran, crippling sanctions collapsed parts of the economy, but also fueled the narrative of external aggression, empowering hardliners. These examples highlight that sanctions rarely operate in isolation. They work best when paired with internal political change, strong enforcement, and broad global coordination. Against Israel, which has robust domestic institutions and the unwavering backing of the United States, EU sanctions alone would be unlikely to achieve immediate or total policy change. Still, they could erode long-term resilience and shift the cost-benefit analysis for Israeli leaders. For Israel, the economic picture shows both vulnerability and resilience. Its economy is export-driven, heavily dependent on technology, defense, and agriculture. The EU is a key destination for these exports, especially high-value goods. Losing privileged access to European markets would hurt sectors like pharmaceuticals, where companies rely on EU approval and distribution, and high-tech, where Israeli startups and research groups thrive on cross-border partnerships. On the other hand, Israel has diversified some of its trade, cultivating ties with Asia, particularly India and China. These relationships could soften the blow of European restrictions, though they do not replicate the same level of institutional cooperation or trust. The American safety net remains Israel's greatest buffer. U.S. aid, investment, and diplomatic protection, especially its veto power at the UN Security Council, ensure Israel is not completely isolated. This complicates the effectiveness of EU sanctions because Israel can lean on Washington to offset some of the pain. The moral dimension of this debate is critical. The EU has built its identity around being a normative power, a defender of human rights, democracy, and international law. It has imposed sanctions on dozens of states for rights abuses, from Belarus to Myanmar to Zimbabwe. It has gone to extraordinary lengths to sanction Russia for its war in Ukraine, hitting its financial sector, energy exports, and political elites. Critics argue that failing to apply the same logic to Israel reveals a double standard, tough on adversaries, but lenient on allies. This damages the EU's credibility not only at home, where public opinion is increasingly critical of Israel's actions, but also abroad. In the global south, accusations of Western hypocrisy are already widespread, with many governments and citizens pointing to the contrast between sanctions on Russia and inaction on Israel. For the EU to maintain its credibility as a moral actor, it cannot selectively enforce its standards. The performance of sanctions in practice would depend on their design. Limited measures, such as banning arms exports to Israel, would be mostly symbolic, since Israel produces most of its own weapons and receives substantial U.S. military support. Targeting individuals with travel bans or freezing the assets of certain politicians would make headlines but not change policy. Stronger steps, like suspending the EU-Israel Association Agreement, banning imports from illegal settlements, or restricting participation in research programs, would cut deeper. Financial sanctions could be the most powerful, isolating Israeli banks and companies from European systems, creating ripple effects across the economy. These would not be easy to circumvent, given the centrality of European financial systems to global commerce. Enforcement would remain a challenge, as some businesses and member states might look for loopholes. But the signal would be unmistakable. Another key aspect is how sanctions impact society. Broad economic sanctions can create suffering for ordinary people, leading to unintended consequences. Instead of pushing citizens to demand change, they can foster nationalism and rally support for the government. Israeli leaders could frame EU sanctions as evidence of European hostility or even anti-Semitism, reinforcing the sense of siege and justifying continued hardline policies. This risk makes targeted sanctions more appealing. By focusing on entities and individuals directly connected to military operations, settlement expansion, or government leadership, the EU could maximize pressure on decision-makers while minimizing harm to ordinary Israelis. Sanctions could also be designed with humanitarian carve-outs, ensuring that medical supplies or civilian goods remain unaffected. The design of sanctions must also include clear conditions. Vague or maximalist demands risk making sanctions permanent with little incentive for change. Instead, the EU could tie sanctions to specific achievable goals, such as halting the bombing of civilian infrastructure, allowing humanitarian aid into Gaza, or freezing settlement expansion in the West Bank. Meeting these benchmarks could trigger partial relief, creating a dynamic where Israel has an incentive to adjust its policies. Over time, if progress stalls, sanctions could escalate to more severe levels. This phased approach would make sanctions more credible and easier to justify to skeptical member states and international partners. The unique selling points of EU sanctions on Israel lie in their symbolic and practical power. Symbolically, they would demonstrate that the EU does not tolerate grave violations of international law, regardless of political alliances. This would restore some of its credibility in global diplomacy and resonate with European publics who increasingly demand action. Practically, sanctions would hit Israel where it is most integrated with Europe, in trade, finance, and technology. Restricting access to European research programs would undermine Israel's reputation as a cutting-edge innovation hub. Suspending preferential trade access would disrupt supply chains for high-value exports. Freezing financial ties would make it harder for Israeli firms to operate internationally. Beyond economics, sanctions could serve as a deterrent to other states. showing that the EU is prepared to act against even close partners. If they cross certain red lines, the ultimate question is whether such measures would actually stop the war in Gaza or end what many see as genocide. For Israel, which frames its military actions as existential for national security, external pressure may not immediately change policy. Leaders could calculate that survival outweighs economic pain, at least in the short term. Yet over time, sustained sanctions that erode Israel's economy, weaken its tech sector, and isolate it diplomatically could shift the balance. Businesses might push for change, political elites might feel the personal costs of isolation, and public opinion could evolve as the price of continued conflict mounts. Combined with grassroots movements like boycott, divestment, and sanctions, international legal proceedings, and diplomatic isolation, EU sanctions could become part of a broader ecosystem of pressure. Change would not come overnight, but it could reshape the long-term calculus for Israel's leadership at present. The prospect of sweeping EU sanctions on Israel remains unlikely due to internal divisions and the geopolitical costs of directly confronting a US-backed ally. The EU has so far focused on humanitarian aid to Gaza, rhetorical condemnation, and limited measures like banning weapons exports from certain member states. But the debate itself is significant. It reflects a growing sense that words alone are not enough when civilian suffering reaches catastrophic levels. Whether or not sanctions are imposed, the discussion highlights the EU's struggle to balance its values with its interests. A struggle that will continue to shape its global role in its relationship with Israel for years to come.